Chapter 2: The European Balance of Power System and Its Collapse. The Russian Enigma. When the era of the French Revolution and Napoleon came to end, Russian troops entered Paris, demonstrating how whimsical the twists of history can be. A half-century earlier, Russia had first intervened in the Western European balance of power by participating in the 7 Years' War and revealing to the world the extremes of absolutism. No one had expected the Russian Tsar to suddenly declare neutrality and withdraw his army. The newly crowned Peter III openly admired Frederick the Great. By the end of the Napoleonic period, another Russian Tsar, Alexander, was already shaping the future of Europe. European liberties and the attendant system of order required the attention of an empire that surpassed the size of all the rest of Europe combined, an empire where autocracy reached a degree unprecedented in the history of other European countries. Since then, Russia has played a unique role in international affairs. Being part of the balance of power system in both Europe and Asia, it contributed to equilibrium and order only by fits and starts. It has started more wars than any other modern major power, yet it also managed to prevent the establishment of a single country's dominance in Europe by standing firm against Charles XII of Sweden, Napoleon, and Hitler, even as key continental elements of the balance of power were defeated. Russian policy has always followed its own rhythm, continuing for centuries, and as a result, this state has sprawled across a territory spanning nearly every climate and culture on the planet. From time to time, its expansion was paused by the need to settle internal conflicts and reshape structures in accordance with the scale of its plans, and then resumed, like a sea tide storming the shore. From Peter the Great to Vladimir Putin, circumstances changed, but the political rhythm remained categorically immutable. Western Europeans, recovering from the shocks of the Napoleonic era, gazed with awe and apprehension at a country whose territory and army size eclipsed the rest of the continent, while the refined manners of the Russian elite could barely hide the primitive essence of this culture, incomprehensible to Western civilization. As the French traveler Marquis de Custine argued in 1843, referring to the pacification of France and the new pro-Russian order in Europe, Russia is a hybrid. It is a viable step in the heart of Europe. Be that as it may, the pride of the Muscovite boyar perfectly shows the heterogeneity of the sources that gave rise to modern Russian society, which is a monstrous mixture of Byzantine pettiness with Tatar ferocity, of Greek etiquette with Asian wild courage. From this mixture emerged a vast power whose influence Europe may experience tomorrow without ever being able to comprehend its causes. Everything about Russia, its absolutism, its size, its global ambitions, and its vulnerabilities, was perceived as an implicit challenge to the traditional European concept of international order, built on balance and containment. Russia's position in Europe and its relationship to European affairs have long been ambiguous. When Charlemagne's empire fractured in the 9th century into territories where modern France and Germany were destined to emerge, Slavic tribes more than 1,000 miles to the east united into a confederation centered on the city of Kiev, now the capital and geographical center of Ukraine, though perceived almost universally by Russians as an integral part of their historical heritage. This land of the Rus was situated at the intersection of civilizations and trade routes. With Vikings to the north, the expanding Arab domains to the south, and nomadic Turkic tribes to the east, Russia was thus constantly poised between temptation and fear. Too distant to feel the influence of the Roman Empire, though Russian monarchs claimed the title Tsar derived from Caesar and saw Roman rulers as models. Christian but seeking spiritual light in the Byzantine Orthodox of Constantinople rather than Rome, Russia nevertheless lay close enough to Europe to share a common cultural lexicon, yet regularly falling out of phase with the continent's historical trends. The result was the establishment of a Eurasian model. The country's might extended to both continents, but in neither was its position particularly secure.
The deepest rift occurred after the Mongol invasion in the 13th century, when a politically fragmented Rus fell and Kiev was destroyed. 2.5 centuries of the Mongol yoke, 1237 to 1480, and the subsequent struggle to restore independence and unity, now led by the Grand Duchy of Moscow, forced Russia toward an Eastern orientation, while Western Europe was discovering new technological and intellectual horizons, creating the modern era. During the Age of Discovery, Russia was occupied with consolidating its status as an independent state and defending its borders from threats on all sides. While the Protestant Reformation led to the establishment of political and religious diversity in Europe, Russia perceived the fall of its religious guiding star, Constantinople, and the destruction of the Eastern Roman Empire by Muslim conquerors in 1453 as a kind of mystical revelation that henceforth the Russian Tsar, as the monk Philothosius wrote to Ivan III in the early 16th century, was the sole ruler of all Christians in the whole world. The country acquired a messianic calling to metaphorically revive the former glory of Byzantium for the benefit of the Christian world. While Europe was gradually learning to value its own multipolarity as a guarantee of the balance of power and restraints on the use of force, Russian historical experience, however, suggested that any limitation of power led to catastrophe. From this perspective, Russia's inability to dominate its immediate surroundings had resulted in the Mongol invasion and later the tragic Time of Troubles, a 15-year period of dynastic chaos prior to the Romanov Restoration in 1613. During these 15 years, foreign invasions, civil wars, and famine claimed the lives of 1/3 of the population. The Peace of Westphalia treated international order as a complex mechanism of checks and balances. The Russians treated it as a perpetual contest of wills, in which Russia was expected to expand its limits in every stage to the absolute maximum of its material resources. This is precisely why Nashokin, the minister to Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, when asked in the mid-16th century to formulate Russia's foreign policy, gave a simple answer. It is fitting for immaculate and chosen men to direct their mental eyes to the affairs of state toward the expansion of the state in all directions, and this is the business of the ambassadorial department alone. This process of expansion eventually evolved into a national outlook and ensured the spread of the modest Principality of Moscow across Eurasia, resulting in the world's largest territorial empire. This leisurely and seemingly inexorable expansion continued until 1917. The American man of letters Henry Adams described the worldview of the envoy in Washington in 1903, by which date Russia's borders had reached Korea, in these terms. The political doctrine of the envoy, like that of all Russians, consisted of a single idea: Russia must advance and, by the force of its inertia, crush everything that stood in its path. When the Russian wave rolled over a neighboring people, it absorbed their energy, drawing them into the development of its own manners and its own race, which neither the Tsar nor the people could, nor wished, to remodel on the Western pattern. In the absence of natural limits, save for the Arctic and Pacific Oceans, Russia was able for several centuries to satisfy its need for expansion, acquiring Central Asia and the Caucasus, penetrating the Balkans and Eastern Europe, establishing itself in Scandinavia and on the Baltic coast, and reaching the Pacific and the Chinese and Japanese borders, plus, for a time in the 18th and 19th centuries, crossing the ocean to found settlements in Alaska and California. When strong, Russia behaved with the imperious confidence of a superpower and insisted on formal respect for its dominant status. When weak, it masked its vulnerability with mystical invocations of its vast internal reserves of strength. Both variations posed a challenge to the Western world, which was accustomed to a more sophisticated and outwardly gentler style. Russia's awe-inspiring expansionist achievements rested on demographic and economic bases that, by Western standards, were not particularly robust. Many regions of the country remained sparsely populated and appeared untouched by modern culture and technology. Thus, global Russian imperialism was paradoxically combined with vulnerability, as if the victory march across half the world generated more potential enemies than it provided security. From this perspective, the Tsarist Empire might be said to have expanded because it was easier to keep going than to stop. Peter the Great in the window to Europe. In this context, a unique Russian concept of political legitimacy arose and developed. While Renaissance Europe was rediscovering the classical humanism of the past and refining new ideologies of individualism and liberty, Russia sought revival through untainted faith and a single divinely sanctioned autocratic rule capable of overcoming all schisms. The Tsar was seen as the earthly embodiment of God, and his commands were to be obeyed without question, for they were by definition just. A shared Christian faith and a common language of the elite, French, seemed to guarantee a convergence of Russian and Western perspectives. Nevertheless, Early European visitors to Tsarist Russia found themselves in a country of almost surreal extremes and wrote that they observed, hidden beneath the thin veneer of a modern Western monarchy, a despotism modeled after the Mongol Tatars, European discipline supporting Asiatic tyranny, as the Marquis de Custine ruthlessly put it. Russia joined the modern European state system under Tsar Peter the Great and did so in its own way, unlike any other country. From both sides, it was an extremely cautious rapprochement. Peter was born in 1672 in a predominantly medieval Russia. By that time, Western Europe had passed through the Age of Discovery, survived the Renaissance and Reformation, and stood at the threshold of the scientific revolution in the Enlightenment. A young giant, nearly 7 feet tall, the energetic and tireless Russian Tsar set about transforming his empire into a state that vividly reflected the extremes of Russia's aspirations. Determined to study the fruits of European civilization and measure Russian achievements against them, Peter became a frequent guest in the shops and manufactories of the emigrant German quarter in Moscow. After ascending the throne, he traveled to the capitals of Western states, where he personally inspected the latest machinery and studied professional disciplines. Convinced of Russia's backwardness compared to the West, Peter announced an ambitious goal: to tear the little people away from their former Asiatic customs and instruct them in the manners inherent to all Christian peoples of Europe. There followed a series of Tsarist decrees. Russians were ordered to wear Western clothing and hairstyles, invite foreign technical specialists, create a modern army and navy, expand and strengthen borders in wars against almost all neighboring states, break through to the Baltic Sea, and build a new capital, St. Petersburg. The latter, Russia's window to Europe, was erected by manual labor through the efforts of a forcibly conscripted workforce on a marshy wasteland personally chosen by the Tsar. Legend has it that the Tsar thrust his blade into the ground and declared, "Here a city shall be." When traditionalists attempted to revolt, Peter swiftly suppressed the rebellion and, judging by the reports that reached the West, personally participated in the torture and execution of the rebel leaders. The paradox of autocracy and messianism. Peter's efforts transformed Russian society and allowed the empire to establish itself among the leading Western powers. However, the suddenness of this transformation left Russia with the need to manage a nouveau riche's insecurity. In no other empire did an absolute monarch feel the need to remind their subjects in writing, as Peter's successor, Catherine the Great, did half a century later, that Russia is a European state. This is proved by the following. The alterations which Peter the Great undertook in Russia succeeded with the more ease because the manners which prevailed at that time and had been brought amongst us by a mixture of different nations and the conquest of foreign provinces were quite unsuitable to the climate. Peter I, introducing European manners and customs among a European people, found such facilities as even he himself had not expected. Russian reforms were invariably carried out by the will of ruthless dictators who tyrannized a population that obediently agreed to cast off the dark past, but felt no certainty about its own future. Nevertheless, Peter, like his successors, reformers and revolutionaries alike, was thanked and revered by his subjects and descendants for awakening them, however mercilessly, and for forcing them to strive for things previously undreamed of. According to recent sociological polls, Stalin has earned a similar degree of recognition in modern Russian society. Catherine the Great, an autocrat and reformer who ruled Russia from 1762 to 1796, went into history as a monarch under whom Russian culture flourished and vast territories were annexed, including the conquest of the Crimean Khanate and the neighboring Zaporozhian Sich, the formerly autonomous Cossack Republic, now central Ukraine. She justified extreme Russian autocracy as the only system of government capable of ensuring the integrity of such a gargantuan state. The extent of the dominion requires an absolute power to be vested in the person who rules over it. It is expedient that the swiftness of the decisions in matters sent from distant parts should compensate for the delay caused by the remoteness of the places. any other form of government would not only be harmful to Russia, but would ultimately be ruinous. Thus, a form of government interpreted in the West as voluntaristic absolutism was perceived in Russia as an elementary necessity, a prerequisite for the state's functioning. The Tsar, much like the Chinese emperor, was an absolute ruler, traditionally endowed with mystical power, commanding continental vastness. However, a crucial difference between the Russian Tsar and his Chinese counterpart was that from the Chinese perspective, the emperor ruled through the benevolence toward his subjects wherever possible. In the Russian Empire, the Tsar's power rested on his ability to impose his will by an indisputable assertion of authority and to impress outside observers with a demonstration of the Russian state's overwhelming force. The Chinese emperor was seen as the embodiment of the superiority of Chinese civilization, encouraging other nations to come and be transformed. The Tsar, meanwhile, was depicted as the personification of Russia's struggle against enemies surrounding it from all sides. Therefore, while emperors were praised for their impartial, detached benevolence, the 19th century statesman Nikolai Karamzin saw in Tsarist severity a sign that the monarch was fulfilling his true destiny. In Russia, the sovereign is a living law. He shows mercy to the good and punishes the wicked, and the love of the former is earned by the fear of the latter. If they do not fear the Tsar, they do not fear the law. In the Russian monarch, all powers are united. Our government is paternal, patriarchal. The father of a family judges and punishes without a protocol. So too the monarch in certain cases must necessarily act by conscience alone. Much like the United States in its westward expansion, Russia found a moral justification for its conquests, that it was carrying order and the light of the Christian faith to pagan lands. The profitable trade in furs and minerals was considered a side benefit. Yet while the American vision evoked boundless optimism, Russia's experience ultimately implied stoic endurance. Situated at the junction of two vast and irreconcilable worlds, Russia believed it had a special mission to bridge these worlds, but feeling threatened from all sides, it felt compelled to fight those who could not appreciate its calling. The great Russian writer and passionate nationalist Fyodor Dostoevsky wrote of that tireless thirst in the Russian people, always present in them, for a great, universal, all-national, all-brotherly union in the name of Christ. The raptures over Russia's synthesis of civilizations provoked despair over Russia's own status. A country, as one influential 19th century critic put it, lonely in the world. To make ourselves noticed, we had to stretch from the Bering Strait to the Oder. In the expansive, yearning Russian soul, as Russian thinkers began to formulate it, there resided a long-standing conviction that one day Russia's many contradictory efforts would be crowned with success. The path less traveled would be rewarded 100-fold, its achievements would be extolled, and Western condescension would turn into fear and admiration. Russia would combine the power and vastness of the East with the refinement of the West and the moral strength of the true religion. Moscow, the third Rome that inherited the mantle of Byzantium, and the Tsar, the successor of the Caesars of the Eastern Rome, the organizers of the Church and its councils, who established the very symbol of the Christian faith, would play a decisive role in ushering in a new era of global justice and brotherhood.
The shadow of the autocrat. Russia at the Congress of Vienna. It was this Russia, seemingly in Europe but not entirely of it, that enticed Napoleon with its vast expanses and its mysticism, only to doom him, as it would Hitler a century and a half later. The people of Russia, hardened by feats of patience and endurance, surpassed Napoleon's Grand Armée and Hitler's hordes in fortitude and courage. When the Russians burned 4/5 of Moscow to deprive Napoleon of supplies and shelter, Napoleon, realizing the failure of his grand strategy, reportedly exclaimed, "What a people! They are Scythians! What resolution! Barbarians!" After the Cossacks drank champagne in Paris, a colossal autocratic shadow loomed over all of Europe, and the latter struggled with all its might to comprehend what Russian ambitions were and what Russia's mode of action would be. By the time the Congress of Vienna took place, Russia found itself in perhaps the position of the most powerful state on the continent. Tsar Alexander, personally representing Russia at the peace conference, was undoubtedly the most autocratic of rulers. A man of deep, if shifting, convictions, he had rediscovered his faith after repeated readings of the Bible in conversations with spiritual advisors. Alexander had no doubt, as indicated in his 1812 letter, that the victory over Napoleon would bring a new, harmonious world based on religious precepts, and he promised, "To the cause of the swiftest establishment of the true kingdom of Christ on earth, I shall dedicate my earthly glory." Perceiving himself as an instrument of the divine will, the Tsar arrived in Vienna in 1814 with a plan for a new world order that was, in some respects, even more radical than Napoleon's universalist scheme. It proposed the establishment of a holy alliance of sovereigns who would sacrifice national interests in the name of a common search for peace and justice, rejecting the concept of the balance of power in favor of Christian principles of brotherhood. As Alexander told Chateaubriand, the French royalist, intellectual, and diplomat, there is no longer an English policy, a French, Russian, Prussian, or Austrian policy. There is now only one common policy, which, for the general good, must be adopted by all states and peoples. This was a peculiar precursor to the Wilsonian doctrine of the essence of world order, even if its principles differed radically from Wilson's. Of course, such a plan, backed by a victorious military march across the continent, challenged the Westphalian concept of a balance of power between sovereign states. Driven by its own new vision of legitimacy, Russia boasted a surfeit of power. Tsar Alexander concluded the war with Napoleon by entering Paris at the head of the Russian army, and in honor of the victory, an unprecedented parade was held. 160,000 Russian soldiers marched in formation on a plain near the French capital, a more graphic demonstration of force, which instilled anxiety even in his allies, is hard to imagine. After a conversation with his confessor, Alexander proposed a draft joint declaration in which the victorious sovereigns agreed that the course formerly adopted by the powers in their mutual relations had to be fundamentally changed, and that it was urgent to substitute for it an order of things based on the exalted truths of the eternal religion of our Savior. The task of the negotiators in Vienna was to translate Alexander's messianic vision into something substantive and compatible with the continued independent existence of European states. That is, to admit Russia into the international order without being smothered by its bear hug.
The Congress of Vienna. The statesmen who gathered in Vienna to discuss a new design for world order had all experienced survival in an era of upheavals that had affected nearly every organizational structure of power. Over the course of 25 years, they had witnessed the rationality of the Enlightenment give way to the passions of the Terror, the missionary spirit of the French Revolution transform under the weight of the expansionist Bonapartist empire, and the power of France wax and wane, spilling over its ancient borders to cover nearly the entire European continent, only to flicker out in the vastness of Russia. The French envoy at the Congress personified these seemingly endless upheavals. Jean Malise de Talleyrand Pédagogue, or simply Talleyrand as he was often called, had accomplished a great deal in his life. He began his career as the Bishop of Autun, then left the church for the revolution, then renounced the revolution to serve Napoleon as foreign minister, then betrayed Napoleon to negotiate the restoration of the French monarchy, and finally arrived in Vienna as the minister of King Louis XVIII. It was customary to call Talleyrand an opportunist. Talleyrand himself would likely have said that his goals were the stabilization of France and the achievement of peace in Europe, and thus he used any opportunity to realize those objectives. Surely, he sought positions that allowed him to directly study the various elements of power and legitimacy without the need to restrict himself in one way or another. It must be admitted that only a truly formidable personality could have placed himself at the epicenter of so many great and contradictory events. In Vienna, Talleyrand labored to bring France a peace that would preserve the country's ancient limits, fixed at the moment its overseas adventures began. In less than 3 years, by 1818, he managed to secure France's entry into the Quintuple Alliance. The defeated enemy was transformed into an ally in the preservation of European order, becoming a member of an alliance originally formed against it. This precedence was replicated at the end of World War II, when Germany was admitted to NATO. The order proposed to Europe by the Congress of Vienna was perhaps the closest to the establishment of a unified governance since the collapse of Charlemagne's empire. The Congress declared that peaceful evolution within the existing order was preferable to the military alternative, that the preservation of the system was more important than any disputes that might arise, and that these disputes should be settled through consultation and negotiation rather than war. After World War I destroyed this vision, it became fashionable to accuse the Congress of Vienna of an excessive preoccupation with the concept of the balance of power, which by its innate dynamics of cynical maneuvering supposedly plunged the world into war. The British delegation at the Versailles negotiations turned to the diplomatic historian C.K. Webster, an author of studies on the Congress of Vienna, with a request to prepare a treatise on how to avoid the mistakes of that Congress. But if such accusations are just, they only apply to the decade preceding World War I. On the whole, the period from 1815 until the turn of the century was the most peaceful in the history of modern Europe, and the decades following the Congress of Vienna were characterized by an extraordinarily stable balance between legitimacy and power. The politicians and statesmen gathered in Vienna in 1418 were in a radically different situation compared to their predecessors who negotiated the Peace of Westphalia. A century and a half earlier, a series of peace treaties following individual wars that had merged into the 30 Years' War was codified through the introduction of a set of rules prescribing general principles of foreign policy. The European order that emerged from this code took existing political institutions as its pointing point, separating them from the religious component. It was expected that the implementation of Westphalian principles would create a balance of power that would prevent future conflicts, or at least mitigate their consequences. For nearly a century and a half, this system restrained the competition of European powers through the more or less spontaneous formation of restraining coalitions when necessary. The participants of the Congress of Vienna saw before them the wreckage of this international order. The concept of the balance of power had proven insufficient to cool the martial fervor of the revolution and the ambitions of Napoleon. Dynastic legitimacy had fallen under the onslaught of revolutionary impulses and the military genius of the Corsican. A new balance of power had to be built upon the ruins of the state system and the Holy Roman Empire. Napoleon had officially overthrown the latter in 806, marking the end of a millennium of institutional continuity, and against the backdrop of a new surge of nationalism caused by the occupation of most of the continent by French troops. This balance of power was meant to prevent the resurgence of French expansionism, which had nearly established French hegemony in Europe, even as the rise of Russia promised a similar danger to the continent from the east. Consequently, the balance of power in Central Europe had to be reconstructed. The Habsburgs, once the dominant dynasty of the continent, were now ruling from Vienna only over their ancestral territories. These were large and multilingual territories, roughly current-day Austria, Hungary, Croatia, Slovenia, and southern Poland, but had lost their former political cohesion. Some small German principalities, whose opportunism had provided a certain elasticity to the diplomacy of the Westphalian system in the 18th century, had perished as a result of the Napoleonic conquests. Their lands were to be redistributed in a manner consistent with the restoration of the balance of power.
Diplomacy and the reconstruction of Germany. Diplomatic activity at the Congress of Vienna differed fundamentally from the practices familiar to us in the 21st century. Modern diplomats possess the capability of direct, real-time contact with their capitals. They receive detailed instructions and commentaries on statement texts by the minute. While their advice regarding local nuances is highly valued, their opinions on matters of grand strategy are sought significantly less often.
The diplomats in Vienna were far removed from their capitals. It took 4 days for a dispatch from Vienna to reach Berlin, and at least 8 days to receive a leadership response to an urgent request, 3 weeks to reach Paris, and even longer for London. Instructions to diplomats were therefore drafted in general enough terms to allow for potential changes in the situation. In other words, diplomats were instructed primarily to focus on universal concepts and long-term interests, while they developed day-to-day tactics largely on their own. Tsar Alexander I was absent from the Russian capital for 2 months. However, he required no instructions. His whims were carried out, and he continued to occupy the participants of the Congress with the fruits of his turbulent imagination. The Austrian foreign minister, Clemens von Metternich, perhaps the most astute and experienced statesman in Vienna, said of Alexander that his character lacked sufficient strength for real ambition, but had enough weakness to allow for vanity. Napoleon asserted that Alexander was endowed with considerable abilities, yet something was always lacking in his deeds. And since no one could predict exactly what would be missing in any specific instance, the Tsar was completely unpredictable. Talleyrand was much more direct. He is not the son of the mad Emperor Paul for nothing. The other participants of the Congress of Vienna quickly reached an agreement regarding the general principles of international order and the necessity of restoring a balance of power in Europe in one form or another, but they had no consensus on what this would mean in practice. Their task was to achieve, so to speak, a reconciliation of perspectives shaped by substantially different historical experiences. Britain, sheltered from invasion behind the English Channel and possessing unique national institutions largely invulnerable to continental upheavals, defined order in terms of the threat of any single power's hegemony. Continental countries perceived the threat to order differently. Their security depended even on minor territorial adjustments far removed from claims of pan-European hegemony. Above all, unlike Britain, they feared institutional transformations in neighboring countries. The Congress of Vienna agreed quite easily on the terms of a general balance of power. As early as 1804, during the war, British Prime Minister William Pitt had put forward a plan to rectify the defects that, in his view, exposed the weaknesses of the Westphalian system. The Westphalian settlements had continued to divide Central Europe as a means of ensuring French influence. To counter this temptation, Pitt reasoned, great masses should be created in Central Europe by merging some of the smaller states to unify the region. This unification was, of course, relative, as 37 principalities still remained on the map of Europe within the territory of present-day Germany. Prussia was seen as the obvious candidate for absorbing smaller states. It initially advocated for the annexation of neighboring Saxony, but yielded to the requests of Austria and Britain, accepting the Rhineland instead. Such an expansion of Prussia's borders promised an emergence of a powerful force on France's frontier, thereby forming a geostrategic reality that had not existed since the Peace of Westphalia. The other 37 German principalities were grouped into a political entity called the German Confederation. This was the solution to Europe's perennial German dilemma. A weak Germany provoked neighboring countries, primarily France, to intervene, while a unified Germany immediately began to show aggression towards its neighbors, prompting them to unite in the face of danger. In this sense, throughout much of its history, Germany was either too weak or too strong for the peace of Europe. The German Confederation appeared too fragmented due to internal contradictions from embarking on conquests, yet it seemed cohesive enough to resist foreign invasions of its territory. This political entity hindered aggression in Central Europe without creating a threat to the two major powers on its flanks, Russia to the east and France to the west. To protect the new territorial order, the Quadruple Alliance of England, Prussia, Austria, and Russia was formed. To the territorial integrity, the guarantee of which the primary task of the alliance, each participant in the agreement attached its own significance. Similarly, the perceived seriousness of threats to this integrity varied. Britain, relying on its naval mastery, felt no desire to bind itself to specific commitments regarding emergency situations. It preferred to wait until a particular threat to the European order took a distinct shape. The continental countries possessed a much narrower margin of safety, as their survival could be called into question by events far less dramatic than those that might trigger British concerns.
Diplomacy and the reconstruction of Germany. Diplomatic activity at the Congress of Vienna differed fundamentally from the practices familiar to us in the 21st century. Modern diplomats possess the capability of direct, real-time contact with their capitals.
They receive detailed instructions and commentaries on statement texts by the minute. While their advice regarding local nuances is highly valued, their opinions on matters of grand strategy are sought significantly less often. The diplomats in Vienna were far removed from their capitals. It took 4 days for a dispatch from Vienna to reach Berlin, and at least 8 days to receive a leadership response to an urgent request, 3 weeks to reach Paris, and even longer for London. Instructions to diplomats were therefore drafted in general enough terms to allow for potential changes in the situation. In other words, diplomats were instructed primarily to focus on universal concepts and long-term interests, while they developed day-to-day tactics largely on their own. Tsar Alexander I was absent from the Russian capital for 2 months. However, he required no instructions. His whims were carried out, and he continued to occupy the participants of the Congress with the fruits of his turbulent imagination. The Austrian foreign minister, Clemens von Metternich, perhaps the most astute and experienced statesman in Vienna, said of Alexander that his character lacked sufficient strength for real ambition, but had enough weakness to allow for vanity. Napoleon asserted that Alexander was endowed with considerable abilities, yet something was always lacking in his deeds. And since no one could predict exactly what would be missing in any specific instance, the Tsar was completely unpredictable. Talleyrand was much more direct. He is not the son of the mad Emperor Paul for nothing. The other participants of the Congress of Vienna quickly reached an agreement regarding the general principles of international order and the necessity of restoring a balance of power in Europe in one form or another, but they had no consensus on what this would mean in practice. Their task was to achieve, so to speak, a reconciliation of perspectives shaped by substantially different historical experiences. Britain, sheltered from invasion behind the English Channel and possessing unique national institutions largely invulnerable to continental upheavals, defined order in terms of the threat of any single power's hegemony. Continental countries perceived the threat to order differently. Their security depended even on minor territorial adjustments far removed from claims of pan-European hegemony. Above all, unlike Britain, they feared institutional transformations in neighboring countries. The Congress of Vienna agreed quite easily on the terms of a general balance of power. As early as 1804, during the war, British Prime Minister William Pitt had put forward a plan to rectify the defects that, in his view, exposed the weaknesses of the Westphalian system. The Westphalian settlements had continued to divide Central Europe as a means of ensuring French influence. To counter this temptation, Pitt reasoned, great masses should be created in Central Europe by merging some of the smaller states to unify the region. This unification was, of course, relative, as 37 principalities still remained on the map of Europe within the territory of present-day Germany. Prussia was seen as the obvious candidate for absorbing smaller states. It initially advocated for the annexation of neighboring Saxony, but yielded to the requests of Austria and Britain, accepting the Rhineland instead. Such an expansion of Prussia's borders promised an emergence of a powerful force on France's frontier, thereby forming a geostrategic reality that had not existed since the Peace of Westphalia. The other 37 German principalities were grouped into a political entity called the German Confederation. This was the solution to Europe's perennial German dilemma. A weak Germany provoked neighboring countries, primarily France, to intervene, while a unified Germany immediately began to show aggression towards its neighbors, prompting them to unite in the face of danger. In this sense, throughout much of its history, Germany was either too weak or too strong for the peace of Europe. The German Confederation appeared too fragmented due to internal contradictions from embarking on conquests, yet it seemed cohesive enough to resist foreign invasions of its territory. This political entity hindered aggression in Central Europe without creating a threat to the two major powers on its flanks, Russia to the east and France to the west. To protect the new territorial order, the Quadruple Alliance of England, Prussia, Austria, and Russia was formed. To the territorial integrity, the guarantee of which the primary task of the alliance, each participant in the agreement attached its own significance. Similarly, the perceived seriousness of threats to this integrity varied. Britain, relying on its naval mastery, felt no desire to bind itself to specific commitments regarding emergency situations. It preferred to wait until a particular threat to the European order took a distinct shape. The continental countries possessed a much narrower margin of safety, as their survival could be called into question by events far less dramatic than those that might trigger British concerns.
This was especially true regarding revolutions, the threat to existing legitimacy. Conservative states intended to erect a barrier against a new wave of revolutions and sought to create mechanisms for preserving the legitimate order, which, naturally, was understood as monarchical rule. The Holy Alliance, proposed by Tsar Alexander, provided a mechanism for protecting the domestic status quo across Europe. The participants in this project saw in the Holy Alliance, subtly adjusted, a way to curb Russian appetites. The right to intervene was limited by the agreed principle that it could only be exercised unanimously. Thanks to this, Austria and Prussia received a veto power to quiet the exalted fantasies of the Russian Tsar. The Vienna system was supported by 3 tiers of institutions: the Quadruple Alliance, intended to overcome potential challenges to the territorial order; the Holy Alliance, created to eliminate threats to internal institutions; unanimity, institutionalized through regular diplomatic conferences involving the heads of the Allied governments. At these conferences, common goals were developed and reactions to emerging crises were discussed. This mechanism of unanimity was in many ways a precursor to the functions of the United Nations Security Council. Conferences were convened in connection with a series of crises and in attempts to determine a general course, such as the uprisings in Naples in 1820 and in Spain in 1820 to 1823, suppressed by the Holy Alliance and France respectively, and the Greek Revolution and War for Independence in 1821 to 1832, supported by Britain, France, and Russia. Unanimity, of course, did not guarantee accord, but in each case, a potentially explosive crisis was successfully managed without war between the major European powers. The Belgian precedent and the fragility of balance. A fine example of the Vienna system's effectiveness was the reaction to the Belgian Revolution of 1830, which sought to separate present-day Belgium from the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. Throughout much of the 18th century, numerous armies had marched across this province of the Netherlands in pursuit of European dominance. For Britain, whose global strategy centered on mastery of the oceans, the flow of the Scheldt, at the mouth of which, directly across the Channel, lay the port of Antwerp, had to remain in the hands of a friendly country and certainly never under the control of any major European power. The London Conference of European Powers marked a demonstration of a new approach. Diplomats recognized Belgian independence but declared the new country neutral, a term previously unknown in the relations of major powers, except for unilateral declarations of neutrality. The new state agreed to not enter into military alliances and could not station foreign troops on its territory. Its security was guaranteed by the major powers, who took upon themselves the obligation to prevent violations of Belgian neutrality. This internationally guaranteed status endured for nearly a century. Its violation became the reason for Britain's entry into the First World War, when German troops invaded France through Belgian territory. The viability of an international order is reflected in the equilibrium it provides, a balance between legitimacy and power, with sufficient attention paid to each element. Neither legitimacy nor power prevents change. Together, they create the conditions for changes to occur evolutionarily, rather than through violence. When the balance of power and legitimacy is properly achieved, a certain degree of spontaneity in action is acquired. Manifestations of power become peripheral and largely symbolic. Because the configuration of forces arises from a common understanding, no party feels the need to mobilize reserves. When the equilibrium is disturbed, restraints vanish and opportunities emerge for the realization of aggressive aspirations and the actions of irreconcilable actors. Chaos lasts until a new system of order is established. This balance of power was the primary achievement of the Congress of Vienna. The Quadruple Alliance addressed challenges to the territorial order, and the memory of Napoleon long subdued a France, suffering, moreover, from revolutionary exhaustion. However, a prudent interpretation of the peace terms facilitated the rapid inclusion of France among the great powers that had initially united to oppose French ambitions. Austria, Prussia, and Russia, who, based on the principle of the balance of power, appeared as rivals, actually pursued a common policy. Austria and Russia effectively postponed the inevitable clash of their geopolitical interests for the sake of successfully suppressing internal discontent.
Only after the legitimate component of this international order was destroyed by the failed revolutions of 1848 did the balance increasingly cease to be interpreted as the maintenance of equilibrium through common adjustments and more as a starting position for a rivalry for supremacy.
Britain as the balancer. As the equilibrium shifted ever more clearly toward power, Britain's role as the equilibrator, the balancer, became truly vital. The hallmarks of this British role were freedom of action and a demonstrated resolve to apply that freedom. The British Foreign Secretary, later Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, provided a classic model of British behavior when, in 1841, he learned of a message from the Russian Tsar proposing an alliance against an evident French encroachment on European values. Britain, Palmerston replied, views the attempt of one state to seize and appropriate to itself territory belonging to another state as a threat, because such an attempt leads to an upsetting of the existing balance of power and, by altering the relative strength of states, may lead in the end to a danger to other countries. Nevertheless, Palmerston's cabinet refused to enter into a formal alliance against France, for it is not the custom in England to enter into engagements with reference to events which have not actually occurred or which are not seen to be of immediate importance. In other words, neither Russia nor France could count on British support in their mutual dealings, and neither side had the right to ignore the likelihood of British armed intervention if it pushed the situation to the point of threatening the European equilibrium. Toward a new international order. The fragile equilibrium of the Vienna system began to disintegrate in the middle of the 19th century under the impact of three trends: the rise of nationalism, the revolutions of 1848, and the Crimean War. In the wake of the Napoleonic Wars, many nations that had lived side by side for centuries began to view their rulers as foreigners. The German philosopher Johann Gottfried von Herder, an apologist for such views, argued that every people, defined by language, fatherland, and folk culture, possessed an innate genius and was endowed with an inherent right to self-government. The historian Jacques Barzoun formulates it thus: at the base of the theory lay a fact. The Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars had redrawn the mental map of Europe. Instead of the horizontal world of the 18th century, the world of dynasties and a cosmopolitan upper class, the West now possessed a vertical unity, nations not exactly separate, but unlike. Linguistic nationalism made traditional empires, particularly the Austro-Hungarian Empire, vulnerable to internal pressure as well as to the grievances of neighbors claiming national kinship with the empire's subjects. The rise of Prussia and the fires of 1848. The emergence of nationalism as a phenomenon also affected the relationship between Prussia and Austria after the establishment of the Great Mass in German territory following the Congress of Vienna. The competition between the two great German powers in Central Europe for control over the 35 minor principalities of the German Confederation was initially restrained by the need to defend Central Europe against external threats. Furthermore, tradition dictated a certain respect for the country whose rulers had occupied the throne of the Holy Roman Emperor for half a millennium. The assembly of the German Confederation, the envoys of all 37 German states, met at the Austrian embassy in Frankfurt, with the Austrian ambassador presiding over the gathering. At the same time, Prussia cherished its own claims to significance. Firmly intended to overcome its limitations, scant population and extended borders, Prussia became a major European player thanks to its leaders' ability to squeeze the maximum possible out of the country for over a century. Otto von Bismarck, the Prussian statesman who brilliantly completed this process, mentioned a series of mighty, decisive, and wise rulers who carefully husbanded the military and financial resources of the country and kept them firmly in their hands, so as to one day throw them with ruthless daring into the crucible of European politics as soon as a favorable opportunity presented itself.
The Vienna settlements strengthened Prussia's already robust social and political structure through geographical expansion. Stretching from the Vistula to the Rhine, Prussia became the personification of German hopes for unity for the first time in history. As years and decades passed, Prussia's relative subordination to Austrian policy began to gall the Northerners, and as a result, Prussia consciously set a course towards confrontation. The revolutions of 1848 were a Europe-wide fire that engulfed nearly every major city. A growing middle class demanded liberal reforms from conservative governments, while the old aristocratic order felt the pressure of rising nationalism. Initially, the uprisings swept everything in their path, rolling from Poland in the east to Colombia and Brazil in the west, the latter having recently gained independence from Portugal after hosting the Portuguese government in exile during the Napoleonic Wars. In France, history seemed to repeat itself. Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew took the throne as Napoleon III, first as a president elected by plebiscite and then as emperor.
The Holy Alliance had been created specifically to counter such destructive phenomena, but the positions of the authorities in Berlin and Vienna became too unstable and the uprisings too widespread, with their consequences being extremely varied, to permit joint efforts. Russia found it beneficial to suppress the revolution in Hungary, thereby preserving Austrian rule there. In other cases, the old order proved strong enough to overcome the revolutionary challenge. However, this order never managed to recover the self-confidence characteristic of the previous period. The Crimean War and the end of conservative solidarity. Finally, the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856 shattered the unity of the conservative states, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, which had been one of the two key elements of the Vienna system's international order. These states had protected existing institutions from revolutions and isolated France, the recent disturber of the continent's peace. Now, another Napoleon III was probing opportunities to assert himself in several directions at once. In the Crimean War, Napoleon III saw a way to end France's isolation and thus joined Great Britain, which intended to prevent and securing access to the Mediterranean. The Anglo-French alliance did indeed restrain the Russians for a time, but at the cost of increasingly embittered diplomacy. The conflict did not begin over Crimea, a peninsula Russia had conquered from an Ottoman vassal in the 18th century, but over simultaneous French and Russian claims to the right to control revered Christian holy sites in Jerusalem, which was then under Ottoman jurisdiction. In the dispute over which denomination, Catholic or Orthodox, would gain direct access to the holy places, Tsar Nicholas I demanded recognition of his right to act as the protector of all Orthodox subjects of the Ottoman Empire, a significant portion of the population occupying strategically important territories. This demand, implying interference in the affairs of a foreign state, was framed as an appeal to universal moral principles, but struck at the very heart of Ottoman sovereignty. The Ottoman refusal to comply provoked Russia into an offensive in the Balkans and military actions in the Black Sea. 6 months later, England and France, fearing the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the destruction of the European balance of power, entered the war on the side of the Turks. All the alliances codified in the decisions of the Congress of Vienna were forgotten. The war was called Crimean because Franco-British forces landed in Crimea to seize the city of Sevastopol, the base of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Russian troops held out under siege for 11 months before scuttling their ships. Prussia remained neutral. Austria committed the folly of deciding to exploit Russia's difficulties to strengthen its positions in the Balkans and mobilized its army.
"We shall astonish the world with the magnitude of our ingratitude." This was how the Austrian minister-president and foreign minister, Prince Schwarzenberg, commented on Austria's actions upon receiving Russia's plea for help. Austria supported the Anglo-French war effort diplomatically, reaching the point of an ultimatum. The attempt to isolate Russia resulted in the end in the isolation of Austria. Just 2 years later, Napoleon III invaded Austrian possessions in Italy under the pretext of supporting the country's unification. Russia did not intervene. In Germany, Prussia gained freedom of maneuver. Within a decade, Otto von Bismarck led Germany towards unification, stripping Austria of its historical role as the champion of German statehood, again with tacit Russian consent. Austria realized too late that in international affairs, a reputation as a reliable partner is far more important than tactical maneuvers.
Metternich and Bismarck. The momentous changes in Germany and in Europe as a whole were personified by two men, the Austrian Foreign Minister Clemens von Metternich and the Prussian Minister-President, later Chancellor of a united Germany, Otto von Bismarck. The contrast between the legacies of these two leading 19th-century Central European statesmen illustrates the shift of the European international order from legitimacy to power in the second half of the century. Both politicians were perceived as archetypal conservatives. Both were considered masters of manipulation in the game of the balance of power. Yet their fundamental conceptions of international order were diametrically opposed, and each manipulated the balance of power for his own ends, with profound consequences for Europe and the world. Metternich's very appointment to his ministerial post testifies to the cosmopolitan character of 18th-century society. Born in the Rhineland near the French border and educated in Strasbourg and Mons, Metternich did not visit Austria until he was 13 and did not settle there permanently until he was 17. He was appointed foreign minister in 1909, became chancellor in 1921, and remained in service until 1948. Fate placed him at the pinnacle of civil power in a fragile empire entering a period of decline. Once one of Europe's most powerful and best-governed states, Austria had become vulnerable due to its central position. Any European upheaval affected the Austrian political climate. Furthermore, the multi-ethnic nature of the empire promised trouble against the backdrop of rising nationalism, a phenomenon unheard of only a generation earlier. For Metternich, stability and reliability became the guiding stars of policy. When everything is shaking, it is first of all necessary that something, it matters not what, should remain steadfast, so that the misguided may find a way, and the destitute a refuge. A man of the Enlightenment, Metternich was raised on the works of philosophers who extolled the power of reason, and he placed little trust in the force of arms. He rejected haste and the drive to solve current problems immediately. He believed the statesman's most important task was the search of truth. In his view, the belief that everything imaginable is achievable is an illusion. Truth reflects the underlying reality of human nature and the structure of society. More radical views do violence to the very ideals they claim to defend. In this sense, invention is the enemy of history, which knows only discoveries, and one can discover only that which exists. For Metternich, Austria's national interests were synonymous with the general interests of Europe. How to hold together a diversity of peoples and languages in a structure that simultaneously respected diversity and presumed a common heritage, faith, and custom. In this perspective, Austria's historical role was to uphold pluralism and consequently peace in Europe. Bismarck, by contrast, was a scion of the provincial Prussian aristocracy, much poorer than their counterparts in Western Germany and significantly less cosmopolitan. While Metternich sought to justify continuity and restore the universal ideas of a European community, Bismarck challenged every recognized authority and premise of his period. Before he came to power, it was taken for granted that German unification would occur, if it occurred at all, through the joint efforts of nationalism and liberalism. Bismarck demonstrated that these trends could be separated, that the principles of the Holy Alliance were not needed to preserve order, that a new order could be built through a conservative appeal to nationalism, and the concept of European order was perfectly capable of resting solely on the assessment of power. The divergence in their views on the nature of international order was clearly manifested in their formulations of national interest. For Metternich, order arises not so much from the pursuit of national interests as from the ability to link those interests with the actions of other states. The great axioms of political science proceed from the recognition of the true interests of all states, for it is in the general interest that the guarantee of existence is found, while particular interests, the cultivation of which is considered political wisdom by restless and short-sighted men, are only secondary. Modern history shows us the application of the principles of solidarity and equilibrium, and of the combined efforts of different states which force a return to common laws. Bismarck rejected the very idea that power could be subordinated to higher principles. His famous maxims preached that security could only be ensured by a correct assessment of the elements of power. A sentimental policy knows no reciprocity. Every government seeks the justification of its actions solely in its own interests, however it may disguise them under legal sentences. For God's sake, no sentimental alliances in which the consciousness of having performed a good deed serves as the sole reward for our sacrifices. The only healthy basis for the policy of a great power is selfishness and not romance. Gratitude and trust will not win a single man to our side. Only fear will do that, if we use it cautiously and skillfully. Politics is the art of the possible, the science of the relative. Final decisions depend strictly on considerations of utility. The European order familiar to the 18th century, a grand Newtonian clock with many interconnected parts, gave way to a Darwinian world where the fittest survive.
The dilemmas of the balance of power. After his appointment as Minister-President of Prussia in 1862, Bismarck set about putting his ideas into practice and transforming the European order. A rift had appeared among the conservative monarchies of the East after the Crimean War. France remained isolated on the continent due to fears of its revived imperial ambitions, and Austria was unable to decide whether its primary role was national or European. In this situation, Bismarck saw an opportunity to create a German national state for the first time in history. Through a series of bold moves between 1862 and 1870, he placed Prussia at the head of a united Germany and positioned Germany itself at the center of a new order. Disraeli called the unification of Germany in 1871 a greater political event than the French Revolution and noted that the old balance of power has been entirely destroyed. The Westphalian and Viennese European orders had relied on a divided Central Europe where competing claims, whether among the numerous German principalities of the Westphalian system or between Austria and Prussia in the Viennese system, balanced one another. With the unification of Germany, a new dominant force emerged, strong enough to defeat any single neighbor and perhaps all the continental powers combined. The bonds of legitimacy vanished. From then on, everything depended on the calculation of available forces. The greatest triumph of Bismarck's career also made the principle of a flexible balance of power difficult, if not impossible, to realize. The defeat of France in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871, a war into which Bismarck had lured France through skillful diplomatic maneuvers, was accompanied by the annexation of Alsace-Lorraine, substantial reparations, and the tactless proclamation of the German Empire in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles in 1871. The new European order was now guaranteed by only 5 great powers, 2 of which, France and Germany, had become sworn enemies. Bismarck understood that a potentially dominant power in the center of Europe could compel all other states to unite against it, as had happened to Louis XIV in the 18th century and Napoleon in the early 19th. Only the most modest and restrained behavior could avoid collective antagonism from neighbors. Subsequently, all of Bismarck's efforts were directed towards ingenious maneuvers to prevent the cauchemar des coalitions, or nightmare of coalitions, as he put it, pointedly in French. In a world of 5 great powers, Bismarck said, it was always safer to be part of a party of 3. This led to a dizzying series of temporary, partially overlapping, and often contradictory alliances, such as the alliance with Austria and the reinsurance treaty with Russia. The goal was to convince the other great powers, with the exception of an irreconcilable France, that it was more profitable to cooperate with Germany than to unite against it. The essence of the Westphalian system, adapted at the Congress of Vienna, lay in its flexibility and pragmatism. This ideologically ecumenical system could theoretically extend to any region and encompass any combination of states. After the unification of Germany and the fixing of France as its perpetual adversary, the system lost its former flexibility. It required a genius of Bismarck's caliber to maintain the multitude of commitments that balanced the system through virtuoso moves. This successfully averted a general conflict for a time. However, a country whose security depends on the birth of a genius in every generation sets itself a task beyond the capacity of any society. The slide toward total war. After Bismarck's forced resignation in 1890, following a clash with the new Kaiser, Wilhelm II, over the powers of the Chancellor, the system of overlapping alliances could only be maintained at the breaking point. The next Chancellor, Leo von Capri, complained that while Bismarck could juggle 5 balls at once, he found it difficult to manage even 2. The reinsurance treaty with Russia was not renewed in 1891 on grounds that it was partially incompatible with the terms of its alliance with Austria, an alliance which Bismarck viewed as purely utilitarian. Almost inevitably, Russia immediately began a rapprochement with France. Such regroupings in the European kaleidoscope of power and counterweight had happened before. The novelty in this case was the institutionalization of the duration of agreements. Diplomacy acquired a different status. It became a field of life and death rather than a supplementary instrument of settlement. Since a change of allies could lead to national catastrophe for those who were abandoned, each participant in an alliance now extorted full protection from its partners, which inevitably led to the escalation of crises and their interlocking nature. Diplomacy was now reduced to attempts to strengthen the internal bonds of each camp, which promised the aggravation of grievances, from the trivial to the grave. Flexibility was finally abandoned when Britain gave up its policy of splendid isolation and after 1904 joined the Entente Cordiale with France and Russia. Moreover, it joined this alliance not formally but fully, conducting corresponding negotiations and assuming moral obligations to defend its allies. England abandoned its former policy and former status of the balancer, partly because of German diplomacy, which provoked a series of crises in Morocco and Bosnia, seeking to break the Franco-Russian alliance and humiliate each of the allies in turn, France in Morocco in 1905 and 1911, Russia in Bosnia in 1908, in hopes of convincing one partner of the other's weakness. Furthermore, the German military program called for the creation of a powerful navy capable of challenging Britain's maritime supremacy. Military planning reinforced the confrontation. Since the Congress of Vienna, Europe had seen only one general war, the Crimean. The Franco-Prussian War was a conflict between 2 adversaries. That war was fought for a specific reason and pursued limited goals. At the turn of the 20th century, military theorists, relying on the achievements of mechanization and new methods of mobilization, began to speak of total victory in a total war. Railroads now ensured rapid movement of troops. With large reserves on all sides, the speed of mobilization became a matter of critical importance. Germany's strategy, the famous Schlieffen Plan, was reduced to the following. Germany had to defeat one of its neighbors before that neighbor could unite with others and strike from the east or the west. Thus, the concept of a preemptive strike was introduced into military planning. Germany's neighbors found themselves in a state of constant tension, forced to accelerate their own mobilization and agree on joint actions to prevent the threat of a German invasion. Mobilization plans became the basis of diplomacy.
However, if political leaders wish to manage the aspirations of the military, it must be exactly the other way around.
The triumph of tactics over strategy, the road to 1914. Diplomacy, which had hitherto adhered to traditional, leisurely ways of conducting business, lagged behind new technologies and the war with which they were fraught. Europe's diplomats continued to believe they were engaged in a common cause. Moreover, since none of the many diplomatic crises of the new century had turned into a global catastrophe, diplomats took credit for it. During the crises in Morocco and Bosnia, mobilization plans had no immediate impact on the course of events because, despite grandiloquent pronouncements, the conflicts simply did not have time to escalate into inevitable military confrontation. Paradoxically, it was the peaceful settlement of these crises that contributed to the development of diplomatic myopia, where actual interests began to be forgotten for the sake of momentary successes. It became taken for granted that tactical victories should be celebrated in the nationalist press, that this was a normal way of conducting political activity, and that in the course of confrontations over minor issues, great powers could hurl threats at one another without allowing disputes to escalate into open war. But history punishes strategic levity, sooner or later. The First World War began because political leaders lost control over their own tactics. For nearly a month after the assassination of the Austrian crown prince by a Serbian nationalist in June 1914, diplomacy was implemented according to the leisurely model that had proven its utility in the crises of recent decades. It took 4 weeks for Austria to prepare an ultimatum. Consultations began. Since it was the height of summer, many statesmen were on vacation. As soon as the Austrian ultimatum was presented in July 1914, rapid decisions were required, and in less than 2 weeks, Europe was embroiled in a war from which it never subsequently recovered. All decisions were made in a situation where the differences between the great powers were in inverse proportion to the manner of these countries' actions. A new concept of legitimacy had emerged, a combination of the nation-state and empire, and none of the great powers saw the institutions of their opponents as the primary threat to their existence. The existing balance of power looked rigid but not aggressive. Relations between crowned heads were cordial, one might say truly familial. With the exception of France's desire to regain Alsace and Lorraine, no great power laid claim to the territories of its neighbors. Legitimacy and power were in actual equilibrium. But in the Balkans, among the shards of the Ottoman Empire's possessions, there were countries, Serbia first and foremost, that threatened Austria with their demands for national self-determination. Should any great power support these demands, a general war in Europe appeared extremely likely, for Austria was in alliance with Germany and Russia with France. A war, the possibility and consequences of which had not been considered, collapsed upon Western civilization following an essentially local event, the assassination of the Austrian Archduke by a Serbian nationalist in June 1914, and dealt Europe a blow that utterly destroyed the memory of a century of peace and order. In the 40 years after the Congress of Vienna, the European order had learned to prevent conflicts. In the 40 years after the unification of Germany, the contradictions in the system only intensified. None of the politicians foresaw the scale of the impending catastrophe which the system of routinized confrontation, relying on modern military equipment, was imperceptibly turning into an inevitability, and all politicians contributed to such a development by ignoring the fact that their actions were dismantling the international order. France constantly spoke of the need to regain Alsace and Lorraine, by force if necessary. Austria was torn between domestic and Central European obligations. Germany attempted to overcome its own fears of hostile encirclement by stinging now France, now Russia, while simultaneously building up naval power, clearly disregarding the fact that, as history teaches, Britain would surely move against the largest power on the continent that also intended to challenge English naval supremacy. Russia, steadily expanding in all directions at once, threatened both Austria and what remained of the Ottoman Empire.
Britain, preferring for the time being to hide the extent of its growing commitment to the Entente, reproduced the flaws of every course. Its support made France and Russia unyielding. Its restraint convinced some German politicians that Great Britain might remain neutral in a European war. Reflecting on how circumstances might have unfolded in alternate historical scenarios is usually a futile exercise. But the war that ended Western civilization was not inevitable. It was born from a series of miscalculations made by state leaders who did not understand the consequences of their own plans, and the catastrophe itself was triggered by a terrorist act in a year considered incredibly peaceful. In the end, military planning diverged categorically from diplomacy. This is a lesson that subsequent generations must not forget.
Legitimacy and power between the world wars. The First World War was greeted with enthusiasm by a patriotic public and by euphoric state leaders who assumed it would be a short, victorious war with limited objectives. Instead, Europe suffered more than 25 million dead and the destruction of the existing international order. The flexible constructions of the European balance of shifting interests were discarded in favor of the confrontational diplomacy of two rigid alliances, and then swept away by trench warfare, leading to a hitherto inconceivable number of casualties. In the course of the war, the Russian, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires were destroyed. In Russia, a popular uprising demanding modernization and liberal reforms was spearheaded by an armed elite proclaiming a universal revolutionary doctrine. After famine and civil war, Russia and its possessions were transformed into the Soviet Union, and Dostoevsky's desire to find a single universal church on earth was transformed into a Moscow-controlled world communist movement that rejected all previous concepts of world order. Woe to the statesmen whose reasons for entering a war do not seem as plausible at its end as they did at its beginning, Bismarck had warned. None of the state leaders who welcomed the war in August 1914 would have done so had they been able to look ahead to 1918. Stunned by the carnage, the statesmen of Europe sought to ensure that the post-war period would differ as much as possible from the crisis-ridden pre-war period that, in their view, had led to the Great War. They chose to forget nearly all the lessons of previous attempts to establish international order, especially those of the Congress of Vienna. This was a mistaken decision. The Treaty of Versailles of 1919 refused Germany the right to be part of the European order, whereas the Congress of Vienna had spared defeated France. The new revolutionary Marxist-Leninist government of the Soviet Union declared that it bore no responsibility for maintaining an international order whose demise would occur in the near future. Remaining on the fringes of European diplomacy, this government was unrecognized by Western powers for a long time. Of the 5 states that had comprised the pre-war system of European equilibrium, the Austro-Hungarian Empire had collapsed, Russia and Germany were excluded from the system, and Britain demonstrated a desire to return to its former historical role, limiting its participation in European affairs only to opposing actual threats rather than preempting potential ones. Traditional diplomacy had brought Europe nearly a century of peace by securing an international order on a fragile balance of power and legitimacy. In the last quarter of that century, the balance had shifted toward power. The architects of the Versailles settlement reinforced the position of legitimacy once again, proposing an international order that could be maintained, if it were viable at all, solely by an appeal to shared principles. Power was ignored or left as is, in decline. A belt of states arising from the implementation of the right to self-determination stretched from Germany to the borders of the Soviet Union and proved too weak to resist either of them. Ultimately, this led to collusion between them. Britain became increasingly detached. The United States, having decisively entered the war in 1917 despite initial reluctance, quickly lost its illusions and withdrew back into relative isolation. The responsibility for providing power thus fell predominantly on France, exhausted by war, drained of human resources and psychological endurance, and increasingly aware that the disparity of force between itself and Germany threatened to become insurmountable. The failure of Versailles. Diplomatic documents have rarely missed their mark as widely as did the Treaty of Versailles. Too punitive for conciliation, too lenient to prevent the resurgence of German ambitions, the terms of this treaty condemned the devastated European democracies to constant anxiety over an irreconcilable and revanchist Germany, as well as a revolutionary Soviet Union. Given that Germany remained outside the framework of the post-war world order, and the Versailles Treaty failed to formulate clear measures to prevent the resurgence of its ambitions, the Versailles Order effectively stimulated the growth of German revisionism. In reality, the only thing that could have prevented Germany from putting its potential strategic superiority into practice were discriminatory conditions that contradicted the moral convictions of the United States, and increasingly Britain.
As soon as Germany began to challenge the terms of the treaty, its enforcement could be guaranteed only by the threat of the ruthless application of French arms and constant American intervention in European affairs. Neither occurred. For 3 centuries, France had kept Central Europe first divided and then unified, independently at first, then in alliance with Russia. But after Versailles, it lost that capacity. France was too exhausted by war to play the role of Europe's policeman, and Central and Eastern Europe were further engulfed by political processes that France could not manipulate. Left alone against a unified Germany, it made pathetic efforts to maintain order by force, but found itself completely demoralized by a new onset of its historical nightmare after Hitler came to power.
The great powers attempted to institutionalize their aversion to war in a new form of international order. A vague slogan of international disarmament was put forward, the implementation of which was deferred to subsequent negotiations. The League of Nations and a series of interstate agreements were supposed to replace armed rivalry with legal mechanisms for dispute resolution. Nevertheless, while membership in the new structures was almost universal and any form of breach of the peace was officially prohibited, no country demonstrated a readiness to fulfill the terms of the treaties. Aggrieved or expansionist nations, Germany, Imperial Japan, Mussolini's Italy, quickly discovered that no serious punishment existed for those who violated the League of Nations covenant or for those who withdrew from the organization. As a result, 2 overlapping and contradictory orders emerged in post-war Europe. The first rested on the rules and norms of international law, primarily the Western democracies interacting among themselves, while the second was formed by states that had broken away from the system to gain greater freedom of action. Threatening both and maneuvering between them for its own ends stood the Soviet Union, with its personal concept of a universal revolutionary world order. Ultimately, the Versailles Treaty failed to provide either legitimacy or a balance of power. Its pitiable vulnerability was vividly demonstrated at the Locarno Conference in 1925. According to the Locarno Treaties, Germany accepted the current western borders and the demilitarization of the Rhineland, which it had agreed to at Versailles, but refused to comply with similar conditions regarding the territories of Poland and Czechoslovakia, a clear indication of its desire to satisfy its appetite and avenge its grievances. Surprisingly, France supported the Locarno agreements, even though by these documents, France's allies in Eastern Europe officially became potential victims of possible German revenge. This can be seen as a hint of France's actions 10 years later in a new crisis situation. In the 1920s, the Weimar Republic appealed to the conscience of the Western world, contrasting the harshness and contradictions of the Versailles Treaty with the more idealistic principles of the League of Nations and the international order it oversaw. Hitler, who came to power in 1933 following a national referendum of the aggrieved German people, cast aside all restraints. He rearmed the country in violation of the Versailles terms and rejected the conditions of the Locarno agreements by reoccupying the Rhineland. Witnessing the absence of any meaningful reaction, Hitler proceeded to systematically absorb the states of Central and Eastern Europe, first Austria, then Czechoslovakia, and then Poland. It should be noted that the situation of the 1930s is by no means unique. In every era, humanity gives birth to demonic figures obsessed with ideas of repression and world domination. The task of statesmen is to prevent their rise to power and to maintain an international order capable of stopping them if they do break through to the top. Alas, the toxic mixture of middle-class pacifism, geopolitical distortions, and the disunity of allies, characteristic of the interwar years, deprive them of that possibility. Europe had built an international order through 3 centuries of armed conflict, and it rejected it because European leaders did not understand the consequences of entering the First World War. Later, they understood the consequences of a new conflagration, but were afraid of the necessity for decisive action. The history of the collapse of international order is a story of abdication and even suicide. Having abandoned the principles of the Peace of Westphalia and reluctantly applying force to defend proclaimed moral alternatives, Europe found itself plunged into a new war, which, upon its conclusion, once again raised the question of a revision of the European order.
The post-war European order. As a result of 2 world wars, the Westphalian concept of sovereignty and the principle of the balance of power have largely lost their significance in the modern order on the continent that gave them birth. Some remnants, however, can still be found in the countries where they penetrated during the era of discovery and territorial expansion. By the end of the Second World War, Europe's material capacity and psychological ability to build a world order were practically exhausted. All continental European countries, with the exception of Switzerland and Sweden, had experienced, or continued to experience, occupation by foreign troops. The economies of all countries lay in ruins. It became evident that no European country, including Switzerland and Sweden, was any longer in a position to shape its future independently. Western Europe found the moral strength to set out on the road to a new world order, and this is the credit of three great men: Konrad Adenauer in Germany, Robert Schuman in France, and Alcide de Gasperi in Italy. Born and educated before the First World War, they preserved some of the philosophical ideas of the old Europe, hope for a better future for humanity. This endowed them with the vision and presence of mind necessary to overcome the causes and consequences of the tragedy. When the continent found itself on the brink of destruction, they turned to the concepts of order from their youth. Foremost among their convictions was this: if they wished to bring solace to their peoples and prevent a recurrence of the tragedy, they had to move past Europe's historical divisions and create a new European order on that basis. They also had to contend with a new division of Europe. In 1949, the Western Allies unified their occupation zones, creating the Federal Republic of Germany. The USSR, in turn, transformed its occupation zone into a socialist state, tied to the Soviets by the Warsaw Pact. Germany found itself thrown back 300 years to the period following the Peace of Westphalia. Its division became a key element of the emerging international structure. France and Germany, the two countries whose rivalry had formed the basis of all European wars for 3 centuries, were the first to engage in the transformation of European history through the merging of key elements of the surviving economic system. In 1952, they established the European Coal and Steel Community as the first step towards an ever closer union of the peoples of Europe. Such was the cornerstone of the new European order. For many decades, Germany had been the primary threat to stability in Europe. In the first post-war decade, it was the course of German policy that acquired decisive importance. Konrad Adenauer became Chancellor of the newly formed Federal Republic of Germany at the age of 73. Bismarck's career at that age was already nearing its sunset. A patrician in spirit and appearance, suspicious of populism, he created a political party, the Christian Democratic Union, which for the first time in the history of German parliamentarism began to rule as a moderate party with a majority of votes. With such support, Adenauer dedicated himself to rebuilding the country after its recent upheavals. In 1955, he led West Germany into NATO. Adenauer was so committed to the idea of a unified Europe that in the 1950s, he rejected hints from the USSR that Germany might be unified again if the Federal Republic abandoned its Western orientation. This decision, of course, reflected the Chancellor's distrust of Soviet initiatives and also showed how much he doubted his society's ability to rebuild a national state in the center of the continent on its own. In any case, he was a man endowed with the greatest strength of spirit. Who else could contemplate a new international order when your own country is divided?
From European balance to global bipolarity. In general, the division of Germany cannot be called a unique event in European history. It served as the foundation for both the Westphalian and Viennese systems. The novelty lay in the fact that one of the Germanys clearly positioned itself as a Western country in the competition of the international order. This was all the more important because the balance of power was largely being formed outside the European continent. For 1,000 years, the peoples of Europe had taken it for granted that fluctuations in the balance of power could be anything at all, yet the balance itself depended on Europe. The emerging world of the Cold War rested on the diplomacy and arms of 2 superpowers: the United States, located across the Atlantic from Europe, and the Soviet Union, stretching across the continent's geographical periphery. America helped restore the European economy through the 1947 Greek-Turkish aid program and the Marshall Plan of 1948. In 1949, the United States of America entered into a peacetime alliance for the first time in its history, namely the North Atlantic Treaty. The European equilibrium, historically formed by the states of Europe, was transformed into an element of the strategy of external powers. The North Atlantic Alliance provided a base for regular consultations between the US and Europe and served as a pillar for a joint foreign policy. But in essence, the European balance of power ceased to be determined solely by European arrangements. From then on, it became a component of the system for containing the USSR worldwide, primarily through the nuclear potential of the United States. Following the shock of 2 devastating wars, Western European countries faced a shift in geopolitical perspective, a challenge to their historical identity. In the first phase of the Cold War, the international order was effectively bipolar, and America directed the activities of the Western Alliance, acting as guarantor and lead partner.
In the understanding of the United States, this alliance represented not a collection of countries acting together to maintain an equilibrium, but a kind of joint venture, with America as the chief executive officer. The traditional European balance of power was based on the equality of all participants in the process. Each sacrificed a portion of their power for a common and generally limited goal, equilibrium. But the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, by integrating the armed forces of the Allies into a common structure, relied primarily on American military might, especially given America's nuclear potential. As long as strategic nuclear weapons remained the main element of Europe's defense, European policy was reduced primarily to psychology, convincing the United States that Europe was part of itself, and acting accordingly in the event of an emergency. The dual balance of the Cold War and the 1989 turning point. The international order of the Cold War was characterized by two sets of checks and balances, which for the first time in history were largely independent of each other: the nuclear balance between the Soviet Union and the United States, and the internal balance within the North Atlantic Alliance, which provided, above all, a psychological equilibrium. American primacy was accepted in exchange for providing Europe with the U.S. nuclear umbrella. European countries developed their own armed forces, not so much for additional defense, but to secure the status of a military ally, a sort of entry ticket to the company headed by the United States. France and Great Britain acquired their own nuclear arsenals, which did not significantly alter the overall balance of power, but allowed them to claim a seat at the great power negotiating table. The realities of the nuclear age and the geographical proximity of the Soviet Union maintained the alliance's integrity for a generation. However, latent contradictions were bound to emerge after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. After 4 decades of the Cold War, NATO was faced with the fact: the war for which the bloc had been created was over. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 quickly led to the reunification of Germany. Simultaneously, the Soviet satellite belt, the Eastern European states upon which the USSR had imposed its system of governance, collapsed. The result for the leaders who founded the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and for those who witnessed the denouement, was this: the third pan-European conflict of the century had ended peacefully. Germany achieved unification as a liberal democracy. It reaffirmed its commitment to European Union, shared values, and joint development. The peoples of Eastern Europe, suppressed for 40 years, some even longer, regained their independence and national cultural identity. The illusion of a new era. The dissolution of the Soviet Union shifted the focus of diplomacy. The geopolitical character of the European order changed fundamentally, as a serious military threat to Europe no longer seemed to exist. In an atmosphere of general exultation, traditional problems of equilibrium were brushed aside as obsolete, with the belief that diplomacy would henceforth be occupied with the spread of shared ideals. The North Atlantic Alliance, it was claimed, should concern itself less with security and more with political influence. The expansion of NATO to the borders of Russia, and perhaps even the inclusion of the latter in the bloc, was seen as a real prospect. The advancement of a military bloc into historically disputed territories, just a few hundred miles from Moscow, was proposed not as a precautionary measure, but as a sensible way of locking in democratic gains. In the face of a direct threat, the international order had been interpreted as a confrontation between two military blocs, dominated by the United States and the Soviet Union, respectively. With the decline of the Soviets, the world became to some degree multipolar, and Europe gained a chance to achieve independence.
The future of Europe. What a path Europe has traveled to reach this point. It set out on global explorations, spreading its practices and values throughout the world. Every century, it altered its internal structure and invented ever new ideas of international order. Now, at its culmination, Europe, recognizing that it must do so to avoid being sidelined, must abandon the political instruments through which it operated for 3.5 centuries. Driven also by the desire to mitigate the consequences of the new German unification, the European Union established a single currency, the euro, in 2002, and created a supranational political structure in 2004. The EU declared Europe whole, integral, and free, resolving its differences through peaceful means. The unification of Germany shifted the balance in Europe, for no constitutional arrangement can negate the fact that Germany remains the most robust and powerful European state. A single currency provided a degree of unity that Europe had not seen since the days of the Holy Roman Empire. Will the EU achieve the global role declared in its charter, or will it, like the Empire of Charles V, prove incapable of maintaining its integrity? The new structure represents, to a certain extent, a renunciation of the Westphalian system. Nevertheless, the creation of the EU can also be interpreted as Europe's return to the Westphalian interstate system, which Europe created, spread globally, defended, and improved throughout most of modern history, this time in the form of regional rather than national unity of power, as a new element of a new global version of the Westphalian system. The hybrid identity between state and confederation. The result is a combination of national and regional approaches, where the full benefits of either have yet to be guaranteed. The European Union diminishes the sovereignty of its members and traditional state functions, such as currency and border control.
On the other hand, European politics remains primarily national, and in many countries, opposition to EU policy has become a major focus of domestic debate. In other words, we have a hybrid, institutionally something between a state and a confederation, operating through ministerial meetings and a common bureaucracy. It is more reminiscent of the Holy Roman Empire than 19th century Europe. But unlike the Holy Roman Empire, at least as it was for most of its history, the EU attempts to resolve internal contradictions by pursuing the goals formulated at the structure's inception. Specifically, a monetary union exists alongside fiscal diversity, and bureaucracy sits uneasily with democracy. In foreign policy, the EU pursues universal ideals without the capacity or power to enforce them, and a cosmopolitan identity competes with national loyalties. European unity does not eliminate divisions along east-west and north-south lines. An ecumenical approach permits the existence of movements for autonomy, Catalonia, Bavaria, Scotland, that undermine state political integrity. The European social model depends on and changes with market dynamics. EU policy supports tolerance and demonstrates a reluctance to defend distinctive Western values, even as member states fear non-European immigration. The quest for a new unifier. The resulting cycle has become a test of the EU's own legitimacy. European states have transferred a significant portion of the powers once considered sovereign rights to the European Union. Because European leaders are still elected, or not, through national democratic processes, these leaders tend to pursue policies of asserting national dignity. Consequently, disputes still arise between various regions of Europe, usually over economic issues. In crises, particularly like the one that began in 2009, the European structure is forced to resort to quite decisive measures simply to survive. Nevertheless, when the public is asked to sacrifice something for the sake of the European project, such appeals often lack a clear understanding of the obligations involved. Leaders then either ignore the will of their people or enter into confrontation with Brussels. Europe has returned to the question from which it once began, only now the question has acquired global proportions. What international order can be built against a backdrop of competing aspirations and contradictory trends? Which countries will become elements of this order, and how will they coordinate their policies? How much unity does Europe require, and how much diversity can it withstand? Or to rephrase it, a question that in the long run appears even more fundamental. Given historical experience, how much diversity must Europe preserve to achieve meaningful unity?
In sustaining a global system, Europe represented the dominant concept of world order. Its statesmen shaped international structures and imposed them on the rest of the world. Today, the very nature of the emerging world order is being called into question, and regions outside Europe will play a significant role in defining its characteristics. Is the world indeed moving toward regional blocs that perform the role of states in the Westphalian system? If so, will a new balance of power emerge? Or will there be a reduction in the number of key players to a minimum, where rigidity becomes inevitable, and the threats of the early 20th century return, with its irreconcilable blocs attempting to overpower one another? In a world where continental structures like America, China, and perhaps India and Brazil have already reached critical mass, how will Europe manage the transition to the status of a regional unit? Thus far, the integration process is primarily implemented as a bureaucratic problem of increasing the competence of various European governing bodies. In other words, through the optimization of familiar institutions. When will an internal stimulus emerge for the realization of a commitment to common goals? European history shows that unification is never achieved solely through administrative procedures. It requires a unifier, Prussia in Germany, Piedmont in Italy, without whose leadership and without a readiness to create a new reality, any unification will be stillborn. Which country or institution will play such a role? Or should we expect the emergence of some new institution, perhaps a social movement, that will take upon itself the definition of the path ahead? Europe's strategic choice. If Europe is destined to achieve unity, no matter by what means, how will it characterize its global role? It has three options from which to choose: strengthening the Atlantic Partnership, declaring and observing neutrality, or entering into a tacit alliance with a non-European power, or finding common interests with such a power. Does this imply new shifts in loyalties, or does Europe see itself as a member of the North Atlantic Bloc, which generally shares its positions? Which path does Europe associate itself? Its recent past of Atlantic unity, or its long history of maneuvering for maximum national interest? In short, is the Atlantic community viable? And if so, as I sincerely hope, how will it define itself? This is a question that policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic must ask themselves. The Atlantic community cannot remain relevant simply by reproducing familiar patterns. While cooperating in shaping global strategy, European members of NATO, in many cases, characterize their policies as neutral, claiming to oversee the observance of rules and the distribution of aid. Yet they often do not know what to do when this model is rejected, or when its implementation is fraught with difficulties. Concrete meaning must be given to the much-cited phrase Atlantic Partnership for a new generation that has grown up in ignorance of the Soviet threat of the Cold War era. Europe's political evolution is of course determined primarily by Europeans themselves, but its Atlantic partners must not remain aloof. Will the new Europe be an active participant in building a new international order, or will it retreat into solving its internal problems? The balance of power strategy characteristic of European great powers is no longer possible in today's geopolitical and strategic realities. However, the emerging structure of rules and norms of the pan-European elite is unlikely to exert sufficient influence on the development of global strategy, unless it takes geopolitical realities into account. The danger of a geopolitical vacuum. The United States has every reason, historical and geopolitical, to support the European Union and prevent it from collapsing into a geopolitical vacuum. The United States, deprived of contact with Europe in politics, economics, and defense, would be turned into an island off the shores of Eurasia, while Europe itself could become an appendage to Asia in the Middle East. Europe, which less than a century ago held a near monopoly on shaping the world order, is in danger of cutting itself off from the ongoing search for a world order by conflating its internal construction with ultimate geopolitical goals. For many, the outcome of the process represents the culmination of generations of effort, a continent united by peaceful means that has renounced power rivalry. Yet, while Europe's soft power values often appear inspiring, other regions only rarely show such unwavering devotion to a unified policy, increasing the likelihood of imbalance. Europe turns inward just as the movement toward a world order, which it gave birth to, encounters a problematic situation that threatens any region unwilling to participate in its formation. Ultimately, Europe now finds itself in a state of suspension between a past it is trying to overcome and a future it has yet to define for itself.